And welcome back, class. This is the true and accurate history of Greece, part 12. I apologize for my absence recently. I originally had strep throat when I began this series, and that mutated into bronchitis, according to the doctors, which has made it difficult to speak, let alone narrate the entirety of Greek history. Regardless, I've followed their instructions. I've had some throat palliatives, and we're ready to get back to business. Now, when we left off, Greece had ended the war with Japan, having successfully defended their homes from invasion. As you can see, we are moving very quickly throughout history, and there's a reason for this. Following the Great Lie and the conclusion of the Second Sino-Hellenic War, Greece entered a long period of peace and putrefaction. For 240 years, Greece wallowed in her achievements and in the grace of its god, Alexander Erchthonius, Athena's son. Alexander allowed and participated in this excess. He married 5 new wives, had scores of children, legitimate and illegitimate, had several colosseums and theaters built in his name, statues everywhere, had the banks and markets working at full capacity in as many cities as he could manage. The people were happy in their theaters and their arenas, watching battles, plays, poems, and epics by Homer, Ovid, and Timon of Phlius. And things were good. But quiet. And the Empire of Greece never thrived in silence. In fact, silence led to decline. Their happiness moved up and down throughout the 17th century and the 16th century preceding it. New discoveries were made, rifling one of the most exciting, though riflemen were few and far between, and those soldiers who knew only how to use bows, swords, and pikes, or even the old muskets, were left to their devices. They remained the same. The army, like the populace, wallowed in complacency. The empire began to crumble from within, began to rot, though it seemed no one was aware of this gradual leprosy overtaking the body of Greece. By the end of the 17th century, happiness was on the decline in the empire. Despite the many plays and theaters available, the people were interested only in themselves. And perhaps that was because of the theaters, though we will discuss that more as we enter the 18th century. Here we are at the beginning of that 18th century, and we can see that little has changed in Greece over the course of half a century. Japan, on the other hand, is beginning to grow its army yet again. In Russia, progress is constantly being made. They are the most powerful nation in the world, and no one is close to overtopping them. Money started getting tight. The people started demanding more and more resources. But the markets were unable to keep up, as there was not enough food to support the growing population, especially a growing population of people who seemed to do nothing at all. About this time, Alexander founded the Hellenic League once again, providing patronage and support for the city-states nearby. This increased his power on the global stage, politically at least, though his military power remained considerably weak. By the mid-18th century, Alexander was a husk of a man, living surrounded by his attendants, who used to be his companions, unable to tend to his own basic needs in the extremes of infirmity. His mortal body had endured so far for 2,000 years, and it was reaching the end of its fortitude. Meanwhile, the people did little else but watch plays, read poems, and argue fruitlessly over the relative artistic merits of Francis Bacon and Aristophanes, and who had liked Shakespeare before he was cool. Society began grinding to a halt. Athena's son's bones were little more than chancrous hollows, more resembling intricate flutes than the building blocks of the human body. His thews had lost all elasticity and lacked the conviction to hold their corporeal burden upright. Clouds floated where his eyes should have dwelt, and all teeth but one had long since slipped their moorings, departing into the blackness of the night. Yet still he seemed lucid to his companions, a rotating crop of attendants who had exchanged bronze lances for glass catheter tubes as Alexander's health percolated from his flesh, and disease-rattled age insinuated itself into every fiber of his being. Though the words of their god often seemed nonsensical, his companions heard them as prophecy, and interpreted them as per their beliefs, or, more often, as per their politics. Embittered by their distasteful task, some of Athena's son's caretakers abused the power of their position to bring themselves more material and carnal comforts. And so it came to pass, near the end of the 18th century, that the companions gradually took control of Greece. The once hallowed duties of laving Alexander's body of filth fell to the serfs, and the companions only deigned to enter the fetid presence of their much-reduced deity to hear his words, so that they might be interpreted for maximum personal gain. They built lavish temples and theaters, accessible only to them and their favored coteries. The printing press was invented around this time, allowing people to more easily access literature. Unfortunately, the majority of people were not interested in the literature of the past, were not interested in learning from their own history. Rather, they read vapid collections of sonnets, poems with no meaning, and books which took on flights of fancy or described the sordid personal lives of the celebrities of the day. Their interest in academia was dying along with their culture. Meanwhile, Montezuma was expanding into the eastern arm of Greece. Washington even founded a city at the north end of the Greek Empire. The companions were not thrilled by this, but they felt that there was little they could do to prevent them. Darius often sent envoys to visit with the Greek, but he accomplished little. Exploration of the world had not even been finished, as the world, for the people of Greece, continued and continued to shrink and shrink and shrink, until it was little more than the few meters surrounding them in their physical space. Little else mattered to them. The companions bartered for luxury goods with Washington, to little or no avail, but eventually the fruits of their labors allowed them to have some deals struck with the Americans. Though the actual long-term benefits of obtaining gold seemed negligible in the grand scheme of things, these luxuries were the only things which seemed to concern the people of Greece. Trade missions were carried out to neighboring city-states to improve relations and to try and get access to those resources which the people of Greece demanded. The 19th century brought first poverty, then depression on a national scale. The coffers slowly emptied, debt mounted, and the companions occasionally deigned to try and shore up profits, but for the most part they were content in their own lavish debauchery. Greece continued to lag behind the rest of the world in technology, and happiness grew into resentment. Misery reigned supreme among the people of the empire, and their society of the spectacle grew more and more insular, more and more withdrawn. They attended plays, but did not discuss them afterwards. They shunned the company of their flesh and blood neighbors in favor of distant pen pals who shared their views. They avoided any intellectual discourse with people who did not agree with them. Progress ground to a halt in the pursuit of luxury. But nobody seemed to notice, and nobody seemed to care. They were too absorbed in themselves. The army fell even further into disarray. Russia completely refused to deal with Greece. Montezuma would not export anything, and the attitude of the ancient Aztec enemy remained guarded. All that remained were the city-states and the occasional goodwill of America, though even that was growing thin. The companions began to see the direness of their straits, and attempted to find some way to bail out the nation's debt. They worked frantically, but as they diverted attention from academia and culture to put it into the pursuit of money, the people grew more and more frustrated and angry with their rulers. They wondered, if Alexander was truly a god, why then did Greece suffer? Why then was Greece so powerless compared to the other nations of the world? Why then could Greece not make any progress? These questions swam through the minds of the people, and many began to even doubt that Alexander was a god as he had claimed. Apologize for the glitch in the simulation there. Meanwhile, Atlanta's influence continued to spread, as did Montezuma's. While abroad, particularly as we can see here in Japan and in the Aztec Empire, riflemen, cavalry, and artillery patrolled the borders, at home, the lackluster soldiers made do with pikes and muskets, weak with rust from years of negligence. Nearly 200 years had passed since the last act of aggression towards Greece, and the people were complacent. Time passed slowly and agonizingly, as the people of Greece looked for some way to improve their lot. They began to attempt to learn more about the world around them, about the wonders which sprouted up occasionally in distant lands, such as the Statue of Liberty, which had been built in Russia in 1858. Scientific theory was finally discovered in 1860, which seemed to process a revolution. And yet, the Greek were unable to find any of the resources they needed to pursue the promise. When Nobunaga and Montezuma offered open border contracts to the companions, they readily accepted. The men who spoke with Alexander's voice had forgotten the ancient rivalry between the three nations over the generations of peace. In this way, they signed the death warrant of their empire. That's all for today's lesson. Until next time, all the best.